My name is Carmen. I'm 33 years old. And this is the story of how the man I once trusted more than anyone told me I was worthless, and how, one cold morning at a train station, a single stranger rewrote my fate. The first time Dean told me I was a failure, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I thought he was joking. We'd only been married 6 months. I still believed in the man who brought me coffee in bed and kissed my forehead every night. But that night, after I'd shared a short story I was working on, he read the last page in silence and said, "You're not a writer, Carmen. You're wasting your time. Be realistic. Be realistic." That was his favorite phrase. A blunt knife he used again and again, never sharp enough to cut me open all at once, but enough to leave invisible bruises over the years. The kind that never quite healed. 9 years later, I was sitting on a splintered wooden bench at platform 3, cradling a beat-up suitcase that held everything I dared to take from that house. One coat. A few worn sweaters. My grandmother's locket. And a handful of rejection letters I'd kept hidden in the back of my desk drawer, reminders that I had once tried to be something more. I didn't cry when I walked out. Not when Dean scoffed and said, "You'll be back. You don't make it in the real world without someone like me." I didn't even flinch. Because the truth was, I had already cried all those tears in the years before. Dean never raised a hand. No, he was too smart for that. But he knew how to destroy a person with silence, with cold stares, with passive-aggressive praise so thin it cut. "You're lucky I'm patient with you, Carmen. Most men wouldn't put up with this." I stared at my reflection in the train station window. Hollow eyes. Lips pressed tight. Shoulders curled inward like I was always bracing for a blow that never came, but always lingered in the air. My brown hair hung limply past my shoulders, tangled and untouched. I didn't even recognize the woman looking back at me. The speaker crackled above, announcing the 6:42 to East Willow arriving shortly. That's where I was headed. East Willow. A town no one talked about. The place I swore I'd never return to. Where my mother still lived in the crooked blue house with the peeling shutters and the smell of cinnamon always floating from the kitchen. A place that held both pain and the last scraps of love I still had in this world. I looked down at my hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of finally letting go. I had stayed too long. Listened to too many lies. Given too many second chances. Dean didn't see me off. He didn't even get up from the couch when I left. Just glanced up from his phone and said, "Make sure you take the trash out with you." That was the last thing he said. That's what I was to him, trash. So I left. Without a word. Without a scream. Because some endings don't come with explosions. Sometimes they're just a soft closing of a door and the quiet sound of a woman finally choosing herself. The platform was half empty, littered with old coffee cups and muddy footprints. I sat there in silence, letting the wind sting my face. I didn't know who I was anymore. Not really. I only knew I couldn't be the woman Dean wanted. Silent. Small. Obedient. I wasn't looking for hope. I wasn't expecting kindness. I wasn't even expecting anyone to look me in the eye. But then I heard a voice behind me. "Need some help?" It wasn't the voice that startled me. It was the warmth in it. Not pity. Not politeness. Just genuine concern, like someone who didn't see a broken woman with a second-hand suitcase, but a person worth talking to. I turned and saw a man, probably in his mid-30s, with slightly messy dark blonde hair and soft green eyes. He wore a gray scarf, loosely knotted, and carried a backpack over one shoulder. He smiled, but not too wide. Not the fake kind. Just enough to feel human. "No, I'm all right," I said, more out of habit than truth. My voice sounded foreign and used. For years I'd been told to lower it, to speak softer, to stop interrupting. The man didn't press. just nodded and sat down at the far end of the bench, leaving space. Respecting it. We sat there in silence as the train approached, its headlights slicing through the early morning fog. I don't know what made me speak again. Maybe it was the quiet between us. Or the way his presence didn't feel invasive. I said, "It's strange. I haven't ridden a train in over a decade. Feels like I'm starting from scratch." He looked over, not surprised I spoke again, just patient. Sometimes that's the only way to find what you lost. I blinked. That sentence, it cracked something open in me. You sound like you've been through something. He shrugged, the ghost of a smile on his lips. We all have. Some of us just carry it in quieter ways. I nodded, my throat tightening. I used to write stories. Fiction. It was all I ever wanted to do. But, somewhere along the way, I stopped. Someone convinced me I wasn't good enough. He didn't rush to speak. Just watched me with those steady eyes. What was their name? He asked softly. I hesitated. Dean. My husband. Ex-husband. As of this morning, anyway. The man nodded, then extended a hand. I'm Micah. Carmen. I took his hand, and for the first time in years, someone held mine without judgment or tension. Just warmth. The train pulled up to the platform with a roar. I stood, clutching the suitcase handle. Micah stepped beside me, keeping pace. As we boarded, he said quietly, "Carmen, you're not alone. Even when it feels like it." His words followed me as I sank into the window seat. I watched the world blur past, gray buildings giving way to bare trees and endless sky. And in that moment, something tiny and stubborn began to rise inside me. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe, a spark. And that spark would lead to something far bigger than I ever imagined. The train rocked gently beneath me, a rhythmic clatter humming through the floor and up into my chest like a heartbeat I hadn't noticed in years. I stared out the window, the trees blurring past in streaks of brown and frost, but I wasn't really seeing them. My mind was still turning over that final moment before I left, Dean's voice, so smug, so sure of himself. You'll be back. You won't make it without me. Those words had clung to me like a second skin for too long. But as the train cut deeper into the countryside, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was Micah, the stranger who saw me without asking for anything. But I could feel the weight of Dean's words begin to slip off, one syllable at a time. Micah sat across from me now, flipping through a book. He hadn't pushed for more conversation, hadn't tried to force comfort on me like most people do when they think you're fragile. He just sat there. Like his presence was enough. And strangely, it was. I turned from the window and spoke without looking at him. Where are you headed? He looked up, offering that same quiet smile. East Willow. Visiting my sister. She just had a baby. My heart twinged. I hadn't thought about babies in years. Dean had made it clear he didn't want kids, said they were distractions, anchors. At the time, I'd told myself I agreed. But deep down, I'd just learned to stop dreaming out loud. East Willow, I murmured. Me too. My mother lives there. I haven't seen her in too long. Micah nodded, as if understanding more than I said. There was a pause before I added, she never liked Dean. Said he dimmed me like a bad light bulb. I didn't listen. He leaned forward slightly, closing his book. It's hard to listen to anyone else when someone's made you forget your own voice. I looked at him then, really looked. He had that kind of face you didn't notice at first. But the longer you stared, the more you realized it was filled with kindness and something deeper, maybe pain, maybe wisdom. Or both. Did you lose your voice too? I asked. Micah chuckled softly, not bitterly. Yeah. Once. For 5 years, I let someone else narrate my life. Told me I was too soft, too boring, too weak to matter. Took me a long time to realize I wasn't the problem. What changed? He hesitated. Then said, one day, she left. Said I wasn't exciting enough. And for a moment I thought maybe she was right. But then I started hiking again. Reading poetry. I picked up the pieces. And slowly I remembered, there's power in quiet people. His words hit me like a warm breeze in winter. For so long, I'd measured myself by Dean's rules, how useful I was, how small I could become to avoid conflict, how much of myself I could hide to keep the peace. But Micah was reminding me there was another way. The train lurched, and I grabbed the edge of the seat to steady myself. Micah reached out instinctively, fingers brushing mine. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was something simpler. A reminder that I wasn't invisible. We arrived in East Willow just after noon. The station was small, its brick walls stained from years of rain and time. I stepped onto the platform and inhaled deeply. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was the first time in years that I felt something resembling home. I turned to thank Micah, but he had already disappeared into the crowd. For a brief second, I panicked. But then I saw him a few feet ahead, waiting by the taxi stand, holding 2 cups of coffee. He raised one and gestured toward me. Thought you might want this, he said. Train coffee's awful. I took it, my fingers brushing his again. Thank you, I said, softer than before. For everything. He looked at me, his eyes gentle but serious. Carmen, whatever you're running from, or trying to forget, just know, you don't have to be that version of yourself anymore. You can start over. Rewrite the whole damn story if you want. A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to believe him. I really did. I don't even know where to begin, I whispered. He shrugged. Sometimes, beginning again is just showing up. With that, he offered a final smile, tipped an imaginary hat, and turned toward the row of taxis. I watched him go. Then I walked slowly down the old gravel road that led to my mother's house. The trees on either side were taller than I remembered, their bare branches reaching toward each other like fingers desperate to hold on. The same way I had once reached for Dean. For love. For validation. For anything that could fill the hole inside me. But today was different. Today, I was walking toward something. I reached the familiar curve in the road where the trees parted and the crooked blue house came into view. It looked exactly as I remembered, faded paint, a creaky porch, the wind chime my mom had made from silver spoons tinkling in the breeze. The door opened before I could knock. My mother stood there, her soft gray curls loose around her face, her eyes filled with both worry and relief. She didn't say a word. Just opened her arms. And I broke. I dropped the suitcase and collapsed into her, sobbing harder than I had in years. It's okay, she whispered. You're safe now. Later that night, after the soup and the warmth and the silence that needed no explanation, I sat on my childhood bed. Everything was still the same, right down to the faded posters on the wall and the bookshelf filled with old notebooks. I opened one, flipping through pages of stories written by a girl who once believed in magic and words and herself. My fingers trembled as I reached for a pen. And I wrote 4 words at the top of a blank page. Dean was wrong about me. The next morning, sunlight poured through the lace curtains like warm honey. I sat up slowly in bed, the smell of my mother's cinnamon tea already wafting in from the kitchen downstairs. For a few blissful seconds, I forgot everything, Dean, the past, the train ride. I was just Carmen again. Not a failure. Not a disappointment. Not a wife with nothing to show for 9 years except stretch marks and scars that didn't show on skin. Just Carmen. The girl who used to dream big. I padded barefoot down the stairs, the old wooden steps creaking beneath my weight. Mom was already at the kitchen table, her gray curls tucked behind one ear, a newspaper in front of her and 2 cups of tea steaming gently. She looked up, smiled. "You slept in. That's a good sign." I smiled back, still a little surprised my face remembered how to do that. "Yeah. I guess it is. We didn't talk much as we ate." She never pushed. That was the thing about my mother, she always knew when silence was a gift, not something to be filled. But when I reached for the honey jar, she gently placed her hand over mine. "You don't have to talk about it," she said. "But I want you to know, you were never the one who failed." My throat tightened. I nodded, unable to find the words, but she understood anyway. She always had. Later that day, I walked through town, hands stuffed in my coat pockets, my boots crunching over frosted leaves. East Willow hadn't changed much. The bakery still had the crooked sign that said fresh rolls daily even though they only baked twice a week. The bookstore still had the faded help wanted sign in the window that had probably been there for 5 years. And the park, thank God, the park looked exactly the same. Even the old tire swing still hung from the oak tree, its rope a little more frayed but somehow still holding on. Kind of like me. I sat on the cold bench across from the duck pond, notebook in hand. The one I'd grabbed from my childhood room the night before. It was nearly full of old stories, unfinished tales of girls who ran away, of castles made of sand, of hearts that mended in the rain. I flipped to the last page and stared at the blank space. The wind nipped at my cheeks as I slowly pulled out a pen. I didn't know what I was going to write. Only that I had to. But before the ink could meet paper, I heard a voice behind me. "Writing something brilliant?" I turned and there he was, Micah. He held a small paper bag from the bakery in one hand, a coffee in the other, his cheeks rosy from the cold. I blinked, stunned. "You're here?" He grinned. "My sister lives 3 blocks over." I walked past the park, saw someone who looked heartbreakingly deep in thought. "Figured it was you." I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that startled even me. "Well, I'm not sure about brilliant, but something, I guess." He sat beside me, the bench creaking under his weight. "Can I see?" I hesitated, then turned the notebook so he could read the sentence at the top. Dean was wrong about me. Micah didn't say anything right away. He just nodded, his eyes soft. "That's the start of a hell of a story," he said quietly. "And I think the rest is going to be even better." I looked down, swallowing the lump forming in my throat. I don't know if I can really do this. Start over. Write again. I feel like I've lost so much time. He shook his head. "Carmen, starting again doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. It means choosing what you want to carry forward." I exhaled slowly, staring at the still water in the pond. I don't even know who I am anymore. Micah leaned back, resting an arm on the back of the bench. "You're a woman who walked away when it mattered most. That takes more strength than most people have. You might not know where you're going yet, but you're not standing still. That's something." We sat in silence after that, watching the ducks glide over the water, the wind stirring the trees. For the first time in years, I felt the kind of quiet that doesn't hurt. Just peace. Micah handed me the paper bag. "Cinnamon bun. Fresh from the oven. If you're going to rediscover yourself, you might as well do it with frosting." I grinned, taking it. "Thanks, Micah. For everything." He stood, brushing crumbs from his coat. "You know where to find me. I'll be here for a couple weeks before I head back to Chicago." "You live in Chicago?" He nodded. "Yeah. I'm a high school English teacher. It doesn't pay much, but it makes me feel alive." A pang of envy hit me. Not of his job, but of his certainty. His sense of purpose. He'd found something he loved and followed it. And here I was, still holding broken pieces, still unsure where they belonged. Micah took a step back and smiled. Keep writing, Carmen. The world's been waiting long enough. And just like that, he was gone again. But this time, his words didn't feel like a goodbye. They felt like a challenge. That night, I lit a candle on my desk, curled up in my old chair, and stared at the notebook again. Then I wrote. Not because I had something profound to say, but because I needed to remind myself that I still had a voice. Even if it trembled. Even if it stuttered. It was mine. The next few weeks unfolded like the first cautious pages of a new chapter, tentative, unsteady, but full of something I hadn't felt in years, possibility. Every morning, I'd brew a cup of my mother's strong black coffee and sit at the little desk in my childhood bedroom, staring at the blank page. Some days the words came easily. Others, they fought me like old ghosts I hadn't quite buried yet. But I showed up. That's what Micah had said, sometimes starting again is just showing up. And I was finally starting to believe him. Micah and I crossed paths often. Sometimes it was at the grocery store, where he'd sneak a bag of gummy bears into my cart when I wasn't looking. Other times we'd sit at the park with our notebooks, not talking much, just writing. It became our quiet ritual. Like two survivors nursing old wounds, side by side. One crisp Thursday afternoon, he handed me an envelope outside the library. "What's this?" I asked, turning it over in my hands. "Just read it." Inside was a flyer, handwritten and photocopied, the ink slightly smudged. It read, "East Willow Winter Writers Circle, first meeting this Saturday at 3 p.m., Downtown Library Room B. Share your stories. Find your voice." I stared at it for a long moment, then looked up. "You're starting a writers group?" He shrugged. "Thought it might be nice. A place for people to write without judgment. You'd be perfect for it." I laughed nervously. "Micah. I've barely gotten through a few pages. I'm not exactly published? Famous? That's not what it's about." He leaned closer, eyes serious now. "It's about showing up. About saying, I matter. That your words matter." I wanted to say no. I wanted to retreat into the safety of my mother's house, where no one expected anything from me. But instead, I found myself nodding. "Okay," I whispered. "I'll come." That Saturday, I stood outside the library, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I hadn't read anything aloud to a room full of strangers since college. And back then, I'd had confidence. Or at least the illusion of it. Now I just had trembling fingers and a dog-eared notebook. Inside room B, 6 chairs formed a loose circle. Micah sat near the window, sipping tea from a thermos. A couple others, an older woman with a knit shawl, a teenager in a band hoodie, and a man with a clipboard, filled out the rest. Micah looked up and smiled. "Hey. You came." I gave a small wave and took a seat beside him. The room smelled of dust and pine-scented air freshener, but the warmth in the circle made me feel oddly at ease. We went around introducing ourselves. The older woman was Judith, a retired nurse who wrote poems about grief. The teenager, Eli, scribbled sci-fi worlds in the margins of his math homework. The man with the clipboard was Harris, an accountant by day, an aspiring playwright by night. When it was my turn, I almost choked. "I'm Carmen," I said slowly, the notebook on my lap a trembling weight. "I used to write. Then I stopped for a long time. And now I'm trying to find my way back." Micah gave a small nod, like he understood every word I didn't say. Judith smiled kindly. "Sometimes the best stories come from the places we run away from." Eli muttered, "That's deep," and I chuckled. Micah motioned toward me gently. "You want to share something?" Every instinct screamed no. But my fingers moved on their own, flipping open the notebook to a page I had almost torn out more than once. I began to read. It was a short story about a woman who left in the middle of the night with only a suitcase and a pen. It wasn't polished. It wasn't clever. But it was honest. When I finished, the room was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes when people are unimpressed. The kind that means they're still processing. Still breathing it in. Judith clapped softly. Eli nodded furiously. Harris said, that line about the mirror, where she didn't recognize herself, that hit hard. And Micah, he didn't say a word. Just looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a very long time. Pride. That night, I sat on the porch with my mother, the stars stretching far above us in the clear East Willow sky. She sipped her tea, watching me from the corner of her eye. You've changed, she said softly. I nodded, staring out at the trees. I feel it. Like I'm slowly coming back to life. She leaned in, resting her head on my shoulder like she used to when I was little. You don't owe anyone your silence, Carmen. Not even the people who once gave you their love with conditions. I swallowed hard, tears prickling at the edges. I know that now. We sat there in silence, the kind that heals instead of hurts. Later that week, I submitted one of my pieces, The Suitcase, to a small literary magazine. I didn't expect much. I'd submitted things before, back when I was younger, hungrier. But this time felt different. This time, I didn't need their approval to feel worthy. Still, when the email came 2 weeks later, we'd love to publish your story in our upcoming issue, I cried like a child. I printed it out, holding the paper in shaking hands. It wasn't just a yes. It was a confirmation that I hadn't imagined all those dreams. That the girl I used to be was still inside me. Alive. Dean called a few days later. His name lit up on my phone like a curse I thought I'd broken. I answered, my voice calm. Hello? There was a long pause, then his voice. Dry. Uncertain. Carmen. I said nothing. I've been thinking. Maybe we rushed things. Maybe we can talk. I almost laughed. The nerve of him. Still believing I might orbit his world again, that I'd be grateful for crumbs of attention. No, I said. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. Just certainty. I'm not coming back, Dean. You were wrong about me. And I finally know that. He stuttered, tried to respond. But I ended the call. For good. And just like that, like closing the final chapter of a bad novel, I was free. The days after Dean's call felt different. Not louder. Not even particularly triumphant. Just quieter, in the right way. Like the air had cleared. Like someone had opened a window in a room I hadn't realized was suffocating me. I didn't tell my mother about the call until the next morning. She was kneading dough in the kitchen, her hands moving with practiced grace, the counter dusted with flour. He called me, I said. She paused, fingers deep in dough. And? I told him no. I told him he was wrong about me. Her hands stilled. She turned, eyes wide with surprise, and then, without a word, she reached out and pulled me into a hug. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. Not for telling him no. But for knowing it was okay to. I cried into her shoulder, the flour sticking to my face. It didn't matter. In that moment, I felt lighter than I had in years. That afternoon, I walked into town with a fresh copy of Willow Words, the small literary magazine that had just published my story. The issue was thin, printed on rough paper, but it was beautiful. My name was right there on page 5. The Suitcase by Carmen Monroe. I stopped by the bookstore. Miss Hensley, who had owned it since I was a teenager, looked up from behind the counter and gasped. Carmen Monroe? As in, published author Carmen Monroe? I blushed, but nodded. Sort of. She rushed over, hugging me tight. You always had it in you, honey. I still remember your high school essay on grief after your dad passed. Made me cry in the back room. I hadn't known she'd read it. I'm hosting an open mic next Friday, she said, pulling out a clipboard. Poetry, short fiction, whatever folks want to share. You'll come? I hesitated. Speaking at the writer's circle had been hard enough. But something in her eyes, something like faith, made me nod. I'll be there. Friday came faster than I expected. The bookstore was warm and packed, every folding chair filled. String lights crisscrossed overhead, casting golden glows on worn paperbacks and vintage posters. The scent of coffee and old paper floated through the air. Micah sat in the back, arms crossed over his chest, wearing that same quiet smile that had become a kind of anchor in my life. I stood by the wall, clutching the copy of my story, heart pounding. When Ms. Hensley called my name, I thought my knees might give out. But I walked to the front anyway. I opened the magazine, cleared my throat, and began to read. It was a story about a woman who lost herself over the years, not in dramatic, sweeping tragedies, but in the little ways. A word here. A silence there. A smile she forced. A laugh she stifled. Until one day, she picked up a suitcase and left without a sound. And found a life she didn't think she deserved. The room was silent when I finished. Then came the applause. Loud. Long reel. Micah stood, clapping too. I stepped down, cheeks flushed, hands trembling, but I was smiling. Not because people clapped. But because for the first time in a decade, I was proud of myself. After the event, Micah walked me home. The air was crisp, stars sharp in the sky like silver pins. I didn't know you were going to read that piece, he said softly. I glanced over. Me neither. He smiled. You've come so far, Carmen. And I hope you see it. I looked at him, this man who had walked into my life at the exact moment I needed reminding that I wasn't broken, just buried. I do now, I said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small package, wrapped in brown paper. I was going to wait, but, here. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a leather journal, its cover embossed with delicate gold lettering. Begin again. I ran my fingers over the words, tears welling in my eyes. I saw it in a shop in Chicago a while ago, he said, almost shyly. And it made me think of you. I hugged it to my chest, then looked up. Micah, why did you help me that day? You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. He looked at me, his expression tender. Because I saw someone I used to be. And because you were the only person who ever stopped to help me all those years ago. My breath caught. He remembered. I still have that pencil, he added, softly. The one you gave me after those kids tore up my poem. I wrote my first real story with it. And now, you've written yours. I stared at him, speechless. Sometimes, the past circles back in ways you can't imagine. Sometimes, the kindness you give when you're young echoes back when you most need it. Micah reached for my hand. No pressure. No expectations. But I'd like to walk beside you, Carmen. For as long as you'll let me. And for once, I didn't feel the need to run, to doubt, to apologize for wanting something good. I simply nodded. I'd like that too. We walked home together under the stars. No promises. Just steps. One after the other. Toward something new. I woke up the next morning with sunlight on my face and a journal by my side. The leather cover of Begin Again was soft, warm, almost pulsing with energy, like it was daring me to start. And for once, I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel like a fraud or a woman clinging to dreams she had no right to chase. I felt ready. Downstairs, Mom was already humming in the kitchen. The scent of her famous apple muffins floated through the air. I patted down in slippers, the journal tucked under my arm, my heart full of something close to hope. I'm proud of you, she said, before I could speak a word. For what? I asked, startled. For coming back to life. It was a strange phrase, so simple, yet it rang with truth. I had been alive for years, technically. But I hadn't been living. Not since the slow erosion began with Dean. Not since I stopped writing. Not since I stopped believing I mattered. And now, I was. A few days later, Micah and I were walking through the open-air market just outside of town. He carried a canvas tote full of books he had picked up for his students back in Chicago. I had my usual paper bag of lavender soap and cinnamon sticks, gifts for my mother. But today, something felt different. I've been thinking, he said, gently pushing up his glasses with one finger. About staying. I blinked. In East Willow? He nodded. There's a position opening up at the community center. Writing classes. Workshops. It's nothing big, but I want roots somewhere that feels like home. I looked at him, my chest tightening in a way I hadn't expected. You're serious? He turned toward me fully. Carmen, I've never been more serious. I've spent a long time watching other people choose me last. You didn't. Even when you didn't know you were doing it, you saw me. That kind of thing stays with a person. I didn't answer right away. My hands gripped the handles of the paper bag like they were the only things tethering me to the ground. I'm scared, I admitted. He reached out, taking one of my hands in his. Me too. But scared doesn't mean it's wrong. Sometimes it means it's real. We walked the rest of the market in a warm, content silence. That evening, I sat on the porch with Mom, the sunset casting orange and rose gold streaks across the sky. I think I love him, I said quietly. She didn't blink. Didn't even act surprised. I know. But I'm terrified. She nodded. Of course you are. You've been told for years that your love didn't matter. That you weren't enough. But that was his lie. Not your truth. I leaned into her shoulder, the way I did as a child. What if I mess it all up? She wrapped an arm around me. Then you write about it. You turn it into art. You don't disappear again. Winter came quickly to East Willow. The town turned quiet under soft snow. The bookstore glowed with fairy lights and laughter. My stories were beginning to appear in other small magazines. Nothing big. But enough to know I was moving forward. And then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope. No return address. My name written in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. Dean. My heart clenched as I opened it, fingers trembling. Inside, a single page. Carmen. I read your story in the magazine. The suitcase. I didn't want to believe it was about me, but I know it is. I was awful to you. I see that now. I didn't know how to love someone who didn't need fixing. And I hated that I couldn't control your light. You were never weak. I just made you feel small because I didn't want to see how big you truly were. I'm sorry. Truly. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know, you were always more than enough. Dean. I stared at the letter for a long time. And strangely, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel anger. Just a soft, detached understanding. Closure isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper in an envelope, arriving exactly when you no longer need it. That night, I told Micah about the letter. He didn't try to analyze it. He just asked one question. What do you want to do with it? I folded it once, carefully, and placed it into a drawer. Nothing, I said. I already wrote my ending. That winter, I taught my first writing class at the community center. 10 students, ranging from 17 to 70. Some wrote poetry. Others scribbled confessions. One woman just wanted to tell the story of her lost child, even if no one else ever read it. I started the first class with the words Micah once told me. Sometimes the best stories begin with courage. And every student wrote it down. Micah sat in the back, not to supervise, but to remind me I wasn't doing this alone. After class, we walked through the snowy park together, fingers entwined in wool gloves. "I have something for you," he said. I stopped. "Another book? You spoil me." He laughed, then pulled out a small black box. "No ring. Just a key. To the cottage by the lake," he said. "It's small. It needs work. But it has a fireplace, and a window that faces the sunrise. I thought maybe we could build something there. Together." I looked at the key in my palm. I thought about Dean, about the hollow house we once shared, the silence, the coldness. I thought about how long it had taken me to believe I could live without permission. That I didn't need to be fixed. That I could be loved as I was. "I'd like that," I whispered. Micah leaned in, resting his forehead gently against mine. "Then let's begin." The cottage was small, weathered, and hidden behind a row of old pine trees on the edge of Larkspur Lake. It had peeling paint, windows that creaked when the wind blew, and a fireplace that hadn't worked properly in years. But to me, it felt like magic. We moved in that spring. The first night we slept there, wrapped in thick quilts and warmed only by the space heater Micah had dragged in from his sister's basement. I lay awake listening to the wind whip off the lake, thinking, so this is what peace sounds like. Not silence. Not emptiness. Not walking on eggshells. Just peace. By summer, we had cleaned out the shed and turned it into a shared writing space. 2 desks facing opposite windows. A bookshelf between them. On the top shelf, I placed something sacred, my first printed story in willow words, alongside the letter from Dean, still folded, still untouched. Micah never asked why I kept it. He didn't need to. Some chapters you don't reopen. But you keep them anyway, as proof that you made it through. One golden evening, as I sat editing a story on my laptop, Micah walked in holding our mail. "Something for you," he said, handing me a stiff envelope. I opened it without thinking. Then froze. It was from Northridge Press, a respected independent publisher in New York. One of the few I had dared to submit to, more out of hope than expectation. I'd sent them a manuscript months ago. The story was called The Suitcase and the Window Seat, a blend of fiction and autobiography. A tale of loss, rediscovery, and the stranger at the train station who changed everything. I unfolded the letter slowly, my hands shaking. "Dear Ms. Monroe, we are thrilled to inform you that we'd like to publish your manuscript. We believe your story is not only deeply moving but will resonate with thousands of readers who have ever felt silenced or small. Enclosed, you'll find our initial offer and contract. Welcome to the Northridge family. Sincerely, Claire Danton, Senior Editor." The letter slid from my fingers and fluttered to the floor. Micah caught me as I staggered back into the chair. "They want to publish it," I whispered. "Micah, they actually want to publish it." He kneeled in front of me, both hands on mine. "Of course they do. You've been writing this story for a long time, Carmen. You just finally let the world read it." I cried. Not out of fear. Not because I needed someone to save me. But because the girl who once believed she'd be nothing without a man had just found out she could move the world with her words. The book came out in early fall. It wasn't a bestseller. There were no book tours or talk shows. But the reviews came in steady and sincere. Letters from women I'd never met. Messages from strangers who said, "I saw myself in your pages." Some even wrote, "Thank you for helping me leave." One afternoon, I returned from the post office to find Micah and my mother sitting on the porch, deep in conversation. When I walked up, Mom smiled at me and said, "You know, I always hoped you'd come back. I just didn't know how strong you'd be when you did." I sat beside her, watching the breeze stir the leaves. "I'm not the same woman who left Dean," I said softly. Micah turned to me, his eyes glowing with that quiet pride. No. You're the woman who chose to leave. Who picked up the pieces. Who rewrote her life from scratch. I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. That night, we held a small launch party at the community center. Friends. Family. Students from the writing class. The room was filled with laughter, music, and trays of homemade lemon bars. Ms. Hensley gave a speech that made me laugh and cry in equal measure. Eli read a new sci-fi story he'd written, now stronger, bolder, more sure of himself. Then came the final moment. Micah stood in front of the group, clearing his throat. He pulled out a small gift bag and handed it to me. I reached in and pulled out a velvet box. Inside wasn't a ring. It was the pencil. The pencil. The one I'd given him all those years ago in high school. The one he'd written his first story with. The one he'd kept, till now. I'm not asking you to marry me, he said, his voice low but steady. I'm asking you to keep writing. To keep remembering who you are. And if someday you want to take the next step, I'll be right here. I stared at the pencil in my palm, worn down, nearly a stub, but whole. Just like me. I stood on my tiptoes and kissed him, softly, like sealing a promise we'd already made. Not just to each other, but to ourselves. A year later, we welcomed our daughter, Lila. She had my mother's eyes and Micah's thoughtful gaze. Even as a baby, she watched the world like it was a story waiting to be told. When she was old enough to hold a crayon, I gave her a blank notebook. She drew a dragon and named him Dream. One morning, I found her scribbling furiously on the porch, her tongue sticking out in focus. "What are you writing?" I asked. She grinned. "A story. About a girl with a suitcase who finds her voice." I laughed, tears pricking my eyes. "Well," I said, kissing the top of her head. "That sounds like a story worth telling." And under the rustling trees, beside the lake that watched our lives unfold, I knew. Dean had been wrong. I was never nothing. I was always everything I needed to be. I just had to remember it. Sometimes we leave not to run away, but to remember who we were before someone convinced us we weren't enough. Carmen didn't just walk away from a toxic marriage. She walked back into her power, her voice, and her life. What would you write in your notebook if no one told you you couldn't? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Echoes, where every heartbreak has a voice, and every voice has a comeback.